They didn't plan an accident. They planned a fire. The factory breathed with a mechanical rhythm. Giant presses slammed, conveyors rattled, and furnaces exhaled heat and smoke in a pattern that Dan Harper had memorized over 15 years. The smell of oil, hot metal, and burned hydraulic fluid was so ingrained it felt like part of his own skin. Every vibration through the floor, every hiss of steam, every clang of machinery was a word in the language he understood instinctively. And then came the unfamiliar sound, the sharp click of high heels on concrete. Not hesitant, not uncertain, but confident, precise, a sound that cut through the din like a scalpel. Dan didn't need to turn immediately to know someone new had entered his domain. She appeared in the center of the production floor, Alice Rowe, clipboard in hand, suit impeccable despite the heat, hair perfectly arranged. She surveyed the chaos around her with the calm authority of someone entirely certain of her purpose. Sparks from welding arcs reflected off her glasses, and for a brief, disorienting moment, Dan thought the world had slowed down just for her. "Mr. Harper?" Her voice was firm, commanding, amplified only slightly by the roar of the machines. "I'm Alice Rowe, corporate. I'm here to announce the closure of this facility, effective immediately." Dan's hand froze mid-adjustment on the hydraulic press, oil-stained fingers hovering over the controls. He turned, jaw clenched, heat rising, not from the furnaces, but from indignation. "Closure? After everything we've done? After the upgrades? After the improvements you don't even know exist?" His words were barely audible above the din, yet sharp enough to draw a few glances from passing foremen. Alice didn't flinch. She adjusted the clipboard, flipping to a spreadsheet with multiple tabs visible, graphs of declining margins, maintenance logs, and cost projections. Corporate has made the decision based on audit results and financial analysis. The numbers are clear. Continuing operations is no longer viable. Dan's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, each footfall a beat in the rhythm of confrontation. "Numbers? You come into a floor that has run for decades, with equipment you haven't touched and staff you haven't trained, and you decide its fate with numbers? You think that's enough?" Alice's gaze remained steady. "I don't make decisions lightly. I assess, I evaluate, I act responsibly. If I do my job correctly, people don't get hurt unnecessarily." "Don't get hurt." Dan's voice rose, reverberating against steel beams. "This floor is more than a balance sheet. Every bolt, every press, every sensor is someone's livelihood. You think a pie chart accounts for that? You think a PDF can replace sweat, blood, experience?" A foreman passing nearby slowed his pace, sensing the electric tension. Sparks flew from a grinder, showering brief orange arcs over the floor. Dan slammed his palm against the console. "You have no idea what this place means to the people here. What it means to me." Alice tilted her head slightly, flipping through the spreadsheet again, her movements calm, almost clinical. "I don't. That's not my role. My role is to follow protocol, to ensure safety and compliance, and to prevent unnecessary losses. I understand the emotional attachment, Mr. Harper, but I cannot allow sentiment to cloud judgment." Dan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The sweat on his brow made his vision sharper. Every detail of the factory floor etched into his memory. The welders, the assembly lines, the stacks of materials ready to be processed. "You think I'll just accept that?" he growled. "You think you can walk in here, announce the end of everything, and leave without a fight?" Her eyes flicked briefly to the foreman, who shuffled awkwardly away, then returned to Dan. "I don't expect you to accept it. I expect you to cooperate." Dan's chest heaved, heat and anger coiling in him like a spring. "Cooperate." He stepped closer, the roar of machinery masking the subtle threat in his posture. "You haven't even spent a day on this floor. You don't know the risks, the people, the systems. And yet you decide." Alice's hand tightened around the clipboard. Her voice was calm, low, and precise. "I decide because I am tasked with responsibility, and I am fully aware that my decision is unpopular. That does not make it wrong." For a long moment, the factory seemed to pulse around them in suspended chaos. Sparks from welding arcs danced over Dan's oil-stained gloves. Alice's reflection glimmered in the glass of the control panels. Each held the other's gaze, a silent war raging, electric and magnetic at once. And then something unexpected flickered between them. Irritation, yes, but also recognition. Mutual awareness of skill, of determination, of stubbornness. Two forces unwilling to yield, two minds locked in opposition, and somewhere beneath the professional fury, the faintest pulse of intrigue, a spark that would not be named. Dan's voice dropped, lower, almost a growl. You may follow protocol. You may follow numbers. But this place, these people, are more than that. And if you proceed, you'll see the consequences firsthand. Alice's hand tapped the clipboard, emphasizing her point. I've considered the consequences. That's why I'm here, to prevent worse outcomes. You may see it differently, but I see it as necessary. Dan's eyes narrowed, absorbing every word, every calm gesture. Sparks reflected in his irises like tiny fires. Necessary, he repeated. We'll see whose version of necessary survives this floor. Alice met his gaze evenly, her expression unwavering. Then we'll see. The roar of machinery surged again, punctuating the silence between them, as if the factory itself were taking sides. Neither moved, neither retreated. In the midst of their professional clash, they both felt it, a dangerous, compelling connection that was part irritation, part respect, part something neither could yet define. The first battle was over words, numbers, and principle. But the war, personal, emotional, and inevitable, had just begun. Night had fallen over the factory like a shroud, muting the noise but not the presence of machines. The hum of idling equipment, the occasional hiss of steam vents, and the faint scent of residual oil and metal filled the air. Dan Harper moved along the upper catwalks with the confidence of someone who knew every vibration, every sound, every hidden flaw in the building like the back of his hand. Alice Rowe followed, slightly hesitant at first, but quick to adapt. In her hand, the clipboard was no longer a shield. It was a notebook of observation, notes, and questions. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, throwing long shadows across the floor. The factory, normally a place of order and schedule, felt transformed at night, quiet, intimate, and threatening all at once. Why are we doing this at night? Alice asked, her voice low, cutting through the hum. Dan didn't look at her immediately. His eyes scanned the floor, checking machinery, noting which systems were powered down and which remained active for safety. Daylight inspections won't tell you the real story, he said finally. The problems don't announce themselves when management is around. You want to know if this place can survive? You walk it when no one's watching. Alice nodded, accepting the unspoken challenge. She adjusted her glasses and followed him down a narrow service corridor, where heat from the presses still lingered, mixing with the faint metallic tang of freshly painted machinery. Sparks of residual electricity danced from a half-shut-down conveyor belt, and Dan moved instinctively to shut it down, a practiced motion that spoke volumes of his experience. You're very hands-on, Alice said, her tone carrying a trace of awe, even as she tried to mask it. Dan glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. I prefer to know the systems by feel, not by report. His voice softened slightly. Numbers don't tell the whole story. Alice scribbled something on her clipboard, but her eyes lingered on him, studying the way he moved. Confident, precise, yet cautious. She had met managers before, corporate enforcers, bureaucrats who would have treated this floor like a spreadsheet come to life. Dan Harper was not that man. He cared. He understood. And for the first time, she realized that her own detachment, her insistence on procedure, might not be enough. Hours passed as they moved from section to section, the stamping presses, the welding bays, the assembly lines. They stopped at each critical point, Dan explaining how a misaligned conveyor could cause catastrophic downtime, how a pressure valve ignored during routine checks could explode under stress, and how every worker's skill was a fragile link in a chain he had learned to protect. Alice listened, asked questions, challenged his assumptions, but without the previous edge of confrontation. Here, in the darkened factory, stripped of corporate oversight, the professional clash became dialogue. Each disagreement became a thread, pulling them closer to understanding, and reluctantly, to trust. At one point, they paused near a furnace. The heat was intense, radiating against their faces, making the air shimmer. Dan wiped a streak of sweat from his forehead. If we're going to save this place, it won't be by following the rulebook. It'll be by knowing what the rulebook misses. Alice's pen hovered over her clipboard. And what about accountability? She asked softly. If something goes wrong, Dan looked at her, eyes sharp, almost piercing in the dim light. Then we'll deal with it together. But ignoring the problem because of procedure won't save anyone. The intensity of his gaze, the sincerity in his tone, it was the first crack in the wall she had built around herself. The first moment she saw him not as an obstacle, but as a person, and the first spark of something dangerously personal ignited. Hours later, they sat on the edge of a maintenance catwalk, legs dangling over the empty space below. The factory floor stretched in shadows beneath them. Machines idle, vents slowly cooling, the night air thick with the scent of oil and dust. Silence settled, heavy and full. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Alice broke it. "I didn't think I'd feel anything here," she admitted, voice almost shy. "I thought I'd just complete my job and leave." Dan exhaled, leaning back against the railing. "I didn't expect to find someone I could actually talk to about this place. About the work. About the people." Their shoulders brushed. Electric, unintentional, but undeniable. Both stiffened slightly, then neither moved away. For a fleeting moment, the animosity that had defined their first encounter melted into something more fragile. Mutual respect, cautious curiosity, and a spark of attraction neither was ready to name. The night ended without conclusion. No declarations, no confessions, just understanding, tentative and dangerous. The forced truce was more than professional. It had become personal. And in the quiet hum of the factory, amid the shadows and machines, the first threads of connection were woven, delicate and potent, ready to be tested in the fires yet to come. The morning after the nocturnal walkthrough brought no relief. The factory looked different in daylight. Massive machines gleaming under fluorescent lights, polished concrete floors reflecting a perfection that belied the hidden stresses Dan had shown Alice the night before. The workers moved with habitual efficiency, but the air still vibrated with the memory of last night. The discussions, the compromises, and the sparks that had flown in the shadows. Dan moved along the floor, clipboard in hand this time, watching the staff. Every glance was a measure, every motion a variable he had to account for. He felt the weight of responsibility, heavier now, knowing Alice had seen the inner workings in ways the reports never could convey. He had barely started coordinating the morning shift when the office phone rang. Dan's brow furrowed. "Harper," he answered. "Dan," said a smooth, commanding voice, one that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "It's Grayson. I'd like to see you in my office." Immediately, Dan's jaw tightened. "On my way," he replied, before the other line could respond. He knew the tone, calculated, not urgent, but unavoidable, the kind of call that could alter trajectories. Meanwhile, Alice was in the conference room, going over her notes from last night, unaware that Grayson had already observed the subtle shift between her and Dan. From his corner office across the city, he studied every email, every report, every interaction she had logged, sensing the undercurrent of something more than professionalism between the two of them. By the time Dan entered Grayson's office, the room smelled faintly of expensive cigars and polished mahogany. Grayson sat behind an imposing desk, legs crossed, hands steepled. His sharp gray eyes measured Dan as though he were both a subject and a chess piece. "Have a seat," Grayson said smoothly. "I understand you've been acquainted with Ms. Rowe." Dan sat, uneasy, but unwilling to show it. "Acquainted enough to know the factory's condition. That was my priority." Grayson smiled faintly. "Of course, but you understand the implications. She is persuasive, perhaps even charming. I would hate for sentiment to interfere with the corporate plan. After all, a factory's closure is not a matter of personal feelings. It is a business decision." Dan's fists clenched. "I'm here to protect the factory and the people who work here. If that clashes with your plans, so be it." Grayson leaned forward, voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Dan, you're a practical man. You understand leverage, don't you? Ms. Rowe's affection, or even mere admiration, could change the outcome. That is why I would like your cooperation indirectly. Ensure she remains focused on closure. The rest, I will manage." Dan froze, recognizing the thinly veiled threat. Grayson was using Alice as a tool, manipulating the trust and tentative bond that had begun to form between them. Rage surged, but he masked it. "Understood," he said curtly, hiding the storm behind controlled words. Back on the factory floor, Alice received her first indication that Grayson was aware. A note slipped under her office door and signed with a single line. Do not let your feelings dictate your judgment. Her chest tightened. Grayson had always been subtle, but this was invasive. Yet she felt something else, too. The stirrings of genuine concern for Dan. That night's walkthrough had changed her perspective. She couldn't see him as just the stubborn engineer opposing her mission. She had glimpsed his dedication, his understanding, his humanity. And that made Grayson's interference all the more infuriating. Dan and Alice crossed paths later in the afternoon. He handed her a schematic of the assembly line, highlighting potential hazards, modifications, and workarounds. Their hands brushed over the paper, a fleeting contact, electric and unintentional. Alice's eyes met his. We can't let him manipulate this, she said quietly. Dan nodded. I know, but we have to be careful. He'll test us. He's smart. And dangerous, Alice added. For the first time, both understood that their professional war had just become personal, not only with each other, but against an enemy who would exploit every bond, every misstep, every flicker of emotion between them. The day ended with the factory quieting down, machines cooling, staff leaving. Dan lingered near a welding bay, inspecting a misaligned panel. Alice approached, clipboard still clutched. Tomorrow night, she said softly. We need to plan our next walkthrough. If we're going to find a way to save this place, we have to be thorough. Together. Dan looked at her, the weight of responsibility and a new, dangerous connection evident in his eyes. Together, he confirmed, voice low. And as the sun set behind the factory, casting long shadows over steel and concrete, both knew one thing. Grayson had stepped onto the board, and the game had changed. Their tentative alliance, their growing respect, and the unspoken sparks between them would be tested like never before. The enemy had emerged. The stakes were higher, and the first threads of romance had intertwined with danger, binding their fates together against a man willing to burn everything to win. The factory was quiet in a way that made every sound, every creak of metal, every hiss of steam, feel amplified. Night had fallen again, but this time, it was different. Dan and Alice moved side by side along the assembly lines, flashlights cutting arcs of light through the shadows. Their previous professional clashes were now tempered by trust, cautious respect, and an unspoken curiosity that neither wanted to name. Dan stopped near a conveyor belt, shining his light over a critical junction. If we replace this actuator, it will stabilize the whole section. Otherwise, a minor overload could shut down the line entirely. His hands moved expertly, demonstrating, while Alice knelt beside him, marking notes. You're meticulous, she admitted quietly. I've never seen anyone understand the factory this way. It's like you speak its language. Dan looked up at her, startled by the softness in her tone. And you're willing to listen. Most managers would have just walked in, read the reports, and left. You actually want to know what's going on. Alice smiled faintly, a rare, genuine curve of lips that lit up her features in the dim glow of the flashlight. I guess I'm learning there's a difference between doing a job and understanding it. They moved deeper into the factory, navigating the maze of machinery, vents, and piping. Occasionally, their hands brushed over a schematic or a tool. Each touch was electric, unintentional, but impossible to ignore. Dan caught her hand once on a lever adjustment and froze for a heartbeat before pulling back. Alice's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't retract. Instead, she met his gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Hours passed. The factory floor became a private world, illuminated only by flashlights and the occasional glow of indicator lights. They talked, not about reports or protocols, but about responsibility, the weight of managing people, and the choices they had to make when lives were at stake. You care about them, Alice said softly, referring to Dan's workers. More than just the numbers. Dan's jaw tightened, and he gave a short nod. It's not just a job. These are people. Families. Dreams built on sweat and steel. He paused, searching her face. You feel the same, don't you? You wouldn't be here if it was only about closing the factory. Alice hesitated, then nodded slightly. I wanted to see if it could be saved. And I trust your judgment. There it was, the unspoken acknowledgement. Trust, respect, and the beginnings of something far more dangerous, attraction. They both sensed it, but neither named it aloud, fearing the vulnerability it would expose. Later, near the maintenance bay, Dan adjusted a pressure valve while Alice recorded readings. Their shoulders pressed together slightly as they leaned over the equipment, and in that moment, the professional barrier faltered. Dan looked up, meeting her eyes. The factory's ambient hum, the metallic scent, and the shadows wrapping around them made the world shrink to the space between them. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Alice spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "We can save this place if we work together. And if we trust each other." Dan swallowed, aware of how close she was. "Then we have to. No distractions." Alice's lips curved faintly, a small, private smile. "I wouldn't call this a distraction." Dan's pulse quickened. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he focused on the valve, pretending to adjust it while his mind raced. The air between them vibrated with unspoken tension, a dangerous closeness neither was ready to admit. Hours later, they paused in the control room, reviewing plans for machinery upgrades that could extend the factory's life. The faint glow of emergency lights bathed the room, turning their shadows long and intertwined. Alice looked at Dan, her eyes reflecting both determination and something deeper. "You make me believe it's possible," she said quietly. Dan met her gaze steadily, the weight of responsibility softened by the intimacy of shared purpose. "And you make me believe it's worth trying." In that quiet moment, amid schematics, flashlights, and the hum of idle machines, the professional alliance became something fragile and real. Neither spoke the words aloud, but both felt them. A connection that was equal parts admiration, respect, and the first flickers of desire. Yet the shadows outside the factory were not empty. From the corner of his city office, Mr. Grayson watched the subtle closeness, noting the glances, the shared nods, the unspoken understanding. He smiled thinly, lips pressed in a line. He knew that Alice's resolve might waver under influence. Emotions could be weaponized. And if she began to question the closure, the insurance payout he had planned could be in jeopardy. Grayson already started formulating his moves, diversions, manipulations, subtle deceptions. Every step Alice and Dan took toward mutual trust would be observed, evaluated, and exploited. But in the factory, in the glow of emergency lights, and under the hum of sleeping machines, Dan and Alice were unaware of the danger. For a few fleeting hours, they had found a fragile, secret sanctuary. And in that hidden world, they allowed themselves to believe, not in reports, not in corporate agendas, but in each other. The sun had barely set when the first ripple of Grayson's plan began to reach the factory floor. Dan and Alice had just finished their evening review of the machinery schematics, lingering over adjustments that could stabilize the assembly line. The control room was quiet except for the soft hum of cooling systems and the faint scratching of Alice's pen across the clipboard. A delivery arrived, an envelope, thick and official-looking, sealed with a corporate emblem. Dan picked it up, eyebrows raised. "I didn't authorize any overnight deliveries." Alice glanced at the envelope. "It's addressed to me." Her hand lingered on the paper for a moment, hesitation flickering in her eyes. "Should I open it?" Dan's jaw tightened. "Wait. Let me see it first." He broke the seal and pulled out the documents. His eyes scanned the contents quickly, and his stomach dropped. The papers were falsified directives, apparently from Alice, instructing the shutdown of critical safety systems, specifically the fire suppression sprinklers in the paint and chemical bays. Every signature looked plausible, every stamp official. The envelope had been deliberately timed to arrive tonight, ensuring the factory staff might assume Alice had ordered the changes. Dan's hands shook slightly as he handed the documents back to Alice. "This is the setup. Grayson's behind this. He's trying to make it look like you gave the orders." Alice's face went pale, her mind racing. "I didn't. I would never. These are falsified. But people could see them and think I did." Dan exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Exactly. And that's why we have to move carefully. Grayson isn't just testing the factory, he's testing us. He wants to break trust before we can even act." Alice looked at him, eyes sharp now with determination. "We can't let him manipulate this. But how do we clear my name without tipping him off that we know?" Dan paused, considering. "We act smart. We don't react emotionally. We protect the factory first, then expose him later. And we need to trust each other completely, no matter what." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Trust, Easier said than done when he's trying to destroy everything we care about. The weight of the envelope and the implication that someone might see Alice as complicit hung over them like a storm cloud. Yet in the tension, Dan reached out instinctively, placing a hand over hers on the clipboard. The contact was brief, electric, but grounding, a reminder that they were not alone in this. Meanwhile, Grayson sat in his penthouse office, watching a live feed of the factory cameras. He saw Alice's subtle hand movements, Dan's focused intensity, and the small, almost imperceptible moment where their fingers brushed over the documents. A slow smile spread across his face. Exactly as planned. He knew the envelope would force doubt, suspicion, even anger. And if he timed it right, it could escalate into a full-blown crisis, all while keeping his insurance scam intact. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Soon, he murmured to himself, they will turn on each other, and the fire will be the final proof I need. Back in the factory, Dan and Alice worked through the falsified directives, tracing circuits, checking sprinkler lines, and ensuring no accidental shutdown could occur. Each movement was deliberate, precise. Every adjustment required both hands and minds to coordinate seamlessly. They were partners now in every sense of the word, bound by a growing trust and shared urgency. You're taking this seriously, Alice said, glancing up at him, voice soft but edged with worry. Dan gave a small, almost wry smile. This isn't just about machines anymore. This is about keeping you safe and proving we can handle Grayson's games. She met his gaze, and for a moment, the tension between them dissolved into something quieter, something dangerous to name aloud. The spark from their previous night had grown into a low-burning ember, one that could flare into passion or destruction depending on the choices they made. Hours later, as the night deepened, they double-checked the sprinkler valves, recalibrated pressure systems, and secured emergency exits. Every step was cautious, but every glance exchanged carried weight. They were no longer adversaries. They were allies navigating a trap laid by a cunning, relentless opponent. Finally, exhaustion set in. Dan leaned against the console, running a hand through his hair. We've done everything we can tonight. But he's clever. He won't stop until he's pushed us into a corner. Alice nodded, closing her clipboard. And when that happens, she didn't finish the sentence. But her meaning was clear. They would face it together. In the shadows of the factory, under the dim emergency lights and the hum of dormant machines, the trap had been set. Grayson's influence was already working its invisible threads, sowing doubt, suspicion, and tension. Yet, for the first time, Dan and Alice felt the full measure of their own connection, a fragile but undeniable force that would be tested by fire, deceit, and danger in the nights to come. The first real challenge had arrived. The envelope was more than paper. It was a signal, a warning. And the war between duty, trust, and emotion was just beginning. The factory was a living furnace. Flames roared from the paint bay, licking warped steel beams and scorching conveyor belts. Smoke twisted in thick black clouds, suffocating and blinding, but Dan and Alice knew they had to move. Hesitation would cost them their lives. Dan surveyed the floor plan in his mind. The main sprinkler system had been sabotaged, but the local fire curtains and secondary vents could be manipulated to create a corridor of survivable air. We can make a path through, he shouted over the roar, pointing to a service passage alongside the mezzanine. It won't stop the fire entirely, but it will give us breathing room. Alice nodded, tapping her tablet furiously to override the lift controls and unlock emergency doors. Give me the codes. If we can open the service shafts, we can bypass the blocked exits and get closer to the control room. Her voice was calm, almost surgical, despite the heat searing her skin. Dan hesitated for a fraction of a second as his eyes fell on the tablet in her hands, its screen flickering with the light of the fire. The falsified orders were still visible on the display. I saw these, he muttered under his breath, panic flaring. His heart wanted to trust her, but his professional instinct screamed doubt. She couldn't have. Yet the document said otherwise. Alice noticed his pause. Dan, now is not the time to argue. We survive first. Her hand gripped his shoulder, pulling him toward the passage. Her tone left no room for hesitation. He followed, internal conflict raging, every step calculated. Together they navigated the smoke-filled corridor, Dan clearing debris with brute strength while Alice keyed overrides to open locked doors. The heat pressed against their backs, the building groaning ominously. At one point, a beam cracked overhead. Dan dove, pulling Alice down just in time, the splintered wood and sparks cascading around them. They scrambled to their feet, and Dan's gaze met Alice's. No words, only the shared acknowledgement that every moment was life or death. They reached a partially activated vent, the local sprinklers hissing to life. A thin sheet of water created a temporary curtain of protection. "It's not perfect," Dan panted, "but it's enough to move forward." Alice pressed her tablet to her chest, hands steady. "I've already sent the encrypted files to the cloud. Even if this burns, the evidence is safe." Dan's shoulders relaxed slightly, his earlier doubt tempered by relief. "Good. Then no matter what happens next, you're not at fault. And I know it." Alice's eyes softened for a brief moment, but she quickly returned to focus. "Then let's finish this. One step at a time. No stops." Together, they pressed deeper into the factory, navigating the heat, the smoke, and the collapsing structure. Every action, every decision brought them closer to the control room, and closer to their final chance to survive the inferno and expose Grayson's treachery. The heat was unbearable, the factory a furnace of collapsing steel and fire. Every breath burned, every step threatened to collapse under the weakened floor. Dan and Alice pressed forward, moving with precision born of urgency and experience. They reached the central stairwell, the last route to the control room. A thick beam had fallen, wedging itself across the steps. Dan's instincts screamed danger, but he went first, testing the stability. "We can get over this," he said, voice tight. "Just follow my lead." Alice carefully stepped behind him, tablet clutched to her chest. Her mind raced, calculating fire spread, structural stress, and escape routes, but she forced herself to move. Professionalism came first, even under extreme stress. Every second counted. Dan's heart pounded as his eyes flicked to the digital screen in Alice's hands. The falsified orders, flashing in high resolution, were real enough to fool anyone. This could ruin her. Could ruin us both. He wanted to believe her, yet doubt gnawed at his judgment. "She saved lives before. I know she wouldn't, but it's right there in front of me." A spark showered from above, igniting a small pile of debris. Instinctively, Dan shielded Alice, pushing her back. The fire crackled and hissed, smoke filling their lungs. "Stay low," he ordered, and they crawled under the beam, hearts hammering in unison. Once past the obstruction, they pressed onward, following the emergency ladders toward the upper maintenance platform. Alice keyed in override codes at each locked door, her hands steady despite the smoke stinging her eyes. Dan cleared rubble and shored up weak supports with makeshift levers. Every action was measured, deliberate, every second survival. They arrived at the control room doorway. The local sprinklers they had activated earlier created a thin corridor of breathable air, enough for them to reach the panels. Dan immediately started rerouting circuits, testing valves and switches. The building groaned around them, flames licking at the edges, but for the first time, they had control over their immediate environment. Alice monitored the sensors, overriding locks, and verifying the encrypted files had reached the cloud. "It's done. The evidence is secure. Even if this place collapses completely, we're protected," she said, voice calm but edged with exhaustion. Dan looked at her, a mix of relief and lingering tension in his eyes. "I should have trusted you from the start." His professional pride warred with personal emotion. "I doubted you, and it almost cost us." Alice gave a tired, small smile. "Now isn't the time for guilt. We move forward, or we die here." The factory's roar had begun to fade slightly, replaced by the hissing of the partial sprinkler system. Yet the air was thick with smoke, heat pressing against their skin like a living force. Dan and Alice paused for a moment, catching their breath, scanning the crumbling surroundings. Every step forward still carried the threat of falling beams or sudden flare-ups. Dan knelt beside the control panel, fingers flying over circuits and valves. The local sprinklers were already active, creating narrow corridors of safety, but they needed full activation to survive the final stretch. "If I can reroute the main lines through the emergency conduits, it should trigger the entire system, ventilation and sprinklers, throughout the plant," he muttered, sweat and soot streaking his face. Alice crouched beside him, tablet in hand, eyes sharp. Do it. I've confirmed the cloud upload went through. The evidence is safe. We can focus on survival. Her calm professionalism masked exhaustion, but her fingers moved with precision over the override keys. The factory groaned around them, a low, threatening symphony of twisted steel and fire. Sparks flew as Dan flipped the final circuit. Hissing intensified, valves opened fully, and water cascaded through the plant. Smoke began to thin, creating a path forward. Move, Dan shouted, grabbing Alice's hand as a beam above groaned ominously. Together, they surged forward through the now passable corridor, leaping over debris, ducking under hanging wires. At the upper maintenance platform, the final obstruction, a collapsed section of catwalk, blocked their path. Dan quickly assessed the weakened supports. I can brace this enough for us to cross, but we need to move fast. Alice nodded, stepping first, using the tablet to monitor structural integrity and ventilation status. Dan followed closely, ensuring each of her steps was safe. Sparks showered around them, but the system's water spray kept the flames at bay. Dan looked at Alice, a mix of awe and relief in his eyes. We made it. We actually did it. Alice allowed herself a brief smile, though her focus remained sharp. We survived first, then justice. For the first time since the fire began, they could see their path to safety clearly. Every calculated step, every coordinated move, every act of trust and professionalism had led to this moment. The technical breakthrough that would allow them to escape the inferno alive and intact. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, and emergency crews began arriving. But Dan and Alice didn't stop. They ran the final meters through the service doors, breathing in cooler night air, lungs filling with relief. The factory behind them still smoldered, but they had conquered it, together, precise and alive. The first rays of dawn cut through the smoke, painting the factory district in shades of gray and gold. The fire was extinguished, the roaring inferno replaced by the hiss of residual water and the occasional crack of steel cooling. Amidst the smoldering ruins, Dan and Alice stood, exhausted, ash-coated, yet alive. Every step through the debris reminded them of the peril they had endured. Fallen beams, scorched machinery, and twisted metal littered the yard. The factory, a place that had once symbolized livelihood, was now nothing more than charred steel and rubble. Yet, somehow, that destruction brought clarity. Alice's tablet vibrated faintly in her hand. The encrypted files she had uploaded to the cloud the night before confirmed their victory. Grayson's manipulation, sabotage, and falsified orders were documented in real time and unassailable. It's done, she said softly, voice tinged with relief. The evidence is safe. He can't touch anyone else. Dan glanced at her, still catching his breath. You didn't just save us, you saved the truth. I owe you my life. His words were heavy with exhaustion and emotion. Alice shook her head slightly, a tired smile breaking through the soot. No, Dan. We did this together. Every step, every choice, every calculated move. We survived because we trusted each other. Their moment of quiet was interrupted by the arrival of flashing red and blue lights. Police officers emerged from the street, guiding Grayson from a sleek black car in handcuffs. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, darted in disbelief as officers read him his rights. For the first time, he realized that his control had slipped entirely, not through chance, but because Alice had acted with foresight, professionalism, and courage. Dan and Alice watched from a safe distance. Justice, Dan murmured, a sense of finality in his voice. Alice exhaled, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. Not just for us, for everyone he tried to destroy. The two of them stood amid the ruins, looking at the skeletal remains of the factory. Smoke curled in the morning light, the ash drifting like gray snow. Though the building was gone, a strange calm settled over them. The fire had consumed the old, leaving behind space for the new, a foundation forged from courage, trust, and resilience. Dan reached for Alice's hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, without hesitation. We survived this, together. Whatever comes next, we face it as one. Alice returned the grip, her voice steady, warm. Together, they walked slowly through the charred yard, the heat and smoke fading, replaced by the crisp air of morning. Every ruined machine, every blackened beam, every puddle of water reflected the trials they had endured and the bond that had emerged from them. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke, but beneath it was hope, trust, and the unspoken promise of a future they would face together. Amid the ashes, the burned factory stood as proof not of destruction, but of survival, justice, and the beginnings of something greater than either of them had known. Thank you for listening to the story. Write your thoughts in the comments.